What if I told you that in the Soviet Union, your rent and utilities for a month might cost you less than a movie ticket today, but a simple pair of blue jeans could cost you an entire month's salary? What if I told you that in the Soviet Union, a medical doctor might be earning less than a bus driver? Or that for the entire duration of the Soviet Union, the price of Moscow metro never rose above 5 kopecks, which is like 5 cents. Welcome to the bizarre world of the Soviet economic system. Today, I want to answer this question. How much did it really cost to live in the Soviet Union? To understand the Soviet cost of living, we have to first forget our modern ideas about price. Because in the USSR's command economy, a price was a number set by the state, and it often had little to do with actual cost or consumer desire. Because of this, every Soviet citizen lived in 3 different economies at once. There was this official economy of your state set paycheck, the social economy, which is a massive safety net of free services, and the all-important second economy, or the unofficial world of markets and connections that made the whole system actually function. To make this real, I want to do something very different and very difficult. I want to compare a person in the Soviet Union, and at the same time, I want to compare a person living in the United States of America. This is going to be very challenging, but I'll try my best. So let's first meet Ivan. Ivan is a mid-level engineer in Moscow in 1975. And on the other side, we have John, which is an engineer in the suburbs of Chicago. So let's first start with their official paychecks. And that is part number 1, the official economy. In the mid-1970s, the average Soviet monthly salary was about 150 rubles. Our engineer, Ivan, makes about 140 rubles a month. Interestingly, this was a bit less than a skilled factory worker, but more than a doctor who might earn about 130 rubles. Now, let's look at John, who is our American engineer. So in 1975, the median family income in the US was about $13,700 a year. As a college-educated engineer, John earns around $15,000 a year, or about $1,250 a month. So Ivan has 140 rubles and John has 1,250. A direct conversion here is probably meaningless. I mean, the only way to compare their lives is to see what they could actually buy. So Ivan, our Soviet engineer, heads to the state-run gastronome, or a grocery store. Here, the prices are incredibly low and almost never change. A loaf of bread is about 20 kopecks, a liter of milk about 25 kopecks. A ride on the spectacular Moscow metro is about just 5 kopecks. This was the core part of the social contract made possible by enormous state subsidies. Just as an example, for every ruble Ivan spent on beef, the state was spending another 2.5 rubles behind the scenes to bring this beef to the shop. Okay, meanwhile in Chicago, John walks into a supermarket filled with like dizzying array of choices. The only limit here is the money in his pocket. So let's compare, not with money, but with time. How long did Ivan and John have to work to afford basic groceries? So, a loaf of bread, for Ivan, that's about 14 minutes of work. For John, it is about 5 minutes. A liter of milk, Ivan works for 17 minutes, John works for 3 minutes. A dozen eggs, about an hour and a half of work for Ivan, for John, less than 10 minutes. When it comes to consumer purchasing power for food, the American system was vastly more superior. But that is only one part of the story. The Soviet system offered a different kind of value, one that addressed the biggest anxieties of the Western life. And this brings us to part number 2, the social wage versus the American insecurity. This is the social economy, or the social wage. This is the bedrock of the Soviet system, a cradle-to-grave safety net provided by the state. And this was the point where the Soviet Union prided itself on very much. Let's start with housing first. Ivan's rent and utilities were a tiny fraction of his budget, maybe about 3% to 5%. The rent rates hasn't been raised since 1928. For our guy John in Chicago, rent was a major expense, easily 15 to 20% of his monthly income. The trade-off here for Ivan, our guy, was a chronic housing shortage. He might have to wait years for a private apartment, and many families lived in these communal flats, like sharing a kitchen and a bathroom. So Ivan had housing security, but John had more privacy and choice. Now, healthcare. For Ivan, it was completely free. The USSR was the first country to establish a universal state-funded healthcare system. Ivan never had to fear that an illness would bankrupt his family. For our guy John in the US, healthcare was a complex web of employer-provided insurance and deductibles and out-of-pocket costs. In 1975, the average American paid about $128 out of pocket for healthcare, which is over $700 in today's money. Any major illness could be financially devastating in a way that our guy, the Soviet guy, would never have to worry about. The Soviet system, of course, had its own serious problems. It was underfunded, they had aging equipment, and many issues with quality of care. But again, the financial anxiety that plagued the American families was entirely absent. Next, let's look at employment. Ivan's job was guaranteed. The Soviet Constitution itself enshrined a right to work. Unemployment was, well, at least officially non-existent. For John, the 1970s were the era of like stagflation, a painful mix of like really high inflation and high unemployment. The unemployment rate in the US peaked at 9% in 1975, and the fear of layoffs, which of course was a major source of stress, and it is still a major source of stress in the United States. And finally, let's talk about education. Ivan's engineering degree was free. In fact, he likely received a state stipend while studying. In return, the state required him to work for 3 years in an assigned location after graduation. For John, a 4-year degree at a public university in 1975 could cost over 500 years in tuition alone, which might seem very, very low to the audience who is currently in the US, but that's true for 1975. And at that time, it was a very significant expense for a family, which again might not seem much right now. And this was actually the beginning of the trend that would lead to America's massive student debt crisis. Okay, we covered the social economy. Let's move on to part 3, which is the consumer goods and aspirations and the second economy. So outside of basic needs, how did Ivan get the things that he really wanted? Luxuries. Welcome to the second economy, the unofficial network that kept the country going. So the legal part was, of course, the kolkhoz market here, or like the farmers market. Farmers could actually sell produce from their small private gardens at market price. The food was fresh and it was really high quality. But the downside was that it was far more expensive than in state stores. And then there was, of course, the illegal part as well. The black market, where you went for like the ultimate status symbols, like Western goods, and nothing was bigger status symbol than the American blue jeans. To a Soviet teenager, this was like the icon of freedom and style. On the black market, a pair of smuggled Levi's could cost you about 200 rubles. For our engineer Ivan, that's over a month of full-time work for just one pair of pants. For John in Chicago, the same pair of Levi's would cost about $12, and that's about like an hour and a half of work. Let's move it up. So a color television, a Soviet-made color TV cost around like 700 rubles. For Ivan, that would be 5 full months of his salary. For John, a new color TV from Sears could take about like $500. That's less than half of his monthly salary, or about 8 days of work. And the ultimate dream, of course, a car, whether you are in the US or in the Soviet Union. In the US, John could buy a new Ford for about $4,800, which is about like 4 months of his salary. In the USSR, the popular Lada cost about 6,000 rubles. For our guy Ivan, the Soviet guy, that's like 3.5 years of work, followed by a multi-year waiting list. Finally, the most important currency in the USSR often wasn't the ruble, it was blood. It was your network of personal connections, who you knew determined if you got a good cut of meat, a spot in a good school, or a voucher for a subsidized vacation to the Black Sea resort. It was a completely different kind of social capital that we cannot imagine in a capitalist economy. Our guy John would never have to make connections to get the best place for vacation. Like, all he needed was literally money, and he would get anything that he would want. So to conclude, what was the real cost of living in the Soviet Union? It was more like a paradox. It was a story of two completely different sets of societal priorities. The Soviet system delivered on its promise of a powerful social safety net. I mean, citizens were guaranteed a job, a home, and education and healthcare. They were insulated from these terrifying economic anxieties like unemployment or medical bankruptcy or student debt. Those were like the core part of the American experience, especially during the difficult 1970s. Many who lived through it remember the stability with fondness. I mean, the Soviet nostalgia, from what I have seen, is real. Many people look back to that time with very much fondness, a sense of collective purpose and pride in their country's superpower status. But of course, the price for this security was paid in other currencies. It was paid in the lack of consumer choice, in the chronic shortages of the official economy. It was paid in time spent navigating a rigid system, and it was paid in a lack of individual economic freedom. The American system, on the other hand, offered a world of immense consumer abundance, personal freedom, and the opportunity for great individual success. But of course, it came with a different price. The economic insecurity, the risk of losing your job, your home, or your health was ever present. I think ultimately it wasn't a question of which system was cheaper, but what price each society chose to pay. The Soviet Union prioritized collective security at the cost of individual choice. The United States prioritized individual choice and consumer comfort at the cost of collective security. Two superpowers, two different worlds, and two vastly different answers to the question what a life should cost. Thank you for watching. This is a massively complex topic, and I've tried to simplify it to the best of my ability in order to relate it more to you guys. In the end, I want to put on a question to you. If given a choice, which system would you choose? Would you choose collective security or lack of individual economic freedom, or the opposite? Feel free to write down in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.